to another episode of the My Edible Earth podcast. This is episode number 2, and it is being recorded on Saturday, January 8th, 2010. The subject of this week's podcast is going to be one that has been a theater of debate for as long as these two technologies have been in existence. There's been many arguments, both pro and con, for both of these technologies, and the technology that I'm talking about are those high definition displays. The first one being your LCD or liquid crystal display, and the second one, your plasma displays. And like I said, there's arguments and pros and cons for both of these technologies, and what I'm going to try and do is explain this in a simple kind of way, so maybe to make you a little bit more informative when you go to these stores and you're looking at the displays and you look at the specifications for these displays. Maybe you'll have a better insight as to what these actual specifications mean, so you can make a little bit more of an informative purchase. Um, so the first thing we need to look at when describing these displays is some of the lingo that behind it. When you go and you look at the little cards underneath the display, and you see all those numbers and terminologies, what does that actually mean? What are they talking about? What does this do? So what I'm going to do is go through each of these different specifications and give you some insight as to what they actually mean when viewing the display, and you'll be able to look at the display and say, oh, I can see that this has a better contrast ratio than that one does, and you may understand what that actually means. So the first item on the lingo list is your screen size. Now that's pretty obvious. The bigger the number, the bigger the display is. But how are these displays actually measured? When it says 50 inch, you know it's a bigger display, but how is it measured? The way they measure these screens is diagonally across the display. So in other words, you measure from the upper right-hand corner to the lower left-hand corner of the display, and that will indicate your size. 50 inch will be 50 inches from, like I said, the upper left to the lower right. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the screen size is that this does not include the bezel of the screen. This is the actual physical screen. The bezel is the little framework, whether it be metal or plastic, that's around the outside of the screen that holds the screen in display. The display size does not include that. The second item on our list is resolution. Now, I know you've all seen these numbers, 720p, 1080p, but what does that actually mean? Again, bigger is better. 1080p displays are a little bit crisper, but what are they actually talking about? Well, what they're talking about is the actual number of scan lines on the display. So, on a 720p screen, you're going to have 720 scan lines that go horizontally across the screen. And likewise, on that 720p display, you're going to have 1280 vertical lines that go across these. And where they intersect, they form a little square, which is known as a pixel. So the more pixels that the screen has, the sharper the display is going to be. Likewise, on a 1080p, you're going to have 1080 horizontal scan lines and 1920 vertical scan lines. Now, why is this important? Well, on your smaller displays, your 24 inches, your 30-inch displays, there really isn't a lot of difference between a 720p and a 1080p. You'd be hard-pressed to notice a difference in the display. But where it really comes into play is on your bigger displays. When you get 50 inches and above, 60-inch displays look much, much better in 1080p resolution than they do in a 720p resolution. Now, to put this into perspective, standard definition, which is your old CRT displays, remember those big boxes you had on your wall sectional or your end table that you viewed TV on? Well, these were all 480p. Which means that they had 480 horizontal scan lines and 640 vertical scan lines. And like I said, on the smaller displays, it really doesn't come into play as much as when you get into those very, very large displays, where a 1080p resolution will look much, much better and much crisper than on a 720p. One way of noticing this, if you go into one of the stores and you look at, say, the lettering, you might see wording on the bottom of a screen or on credits. If you're looking at it on a big display and these credits are going up and it's a 720p resolution, you might see little what they call jaggies, and where the edges of the letters are serrated almost. That's because there's not enough pixels to make that a clean line. On a 1080p, you won't see that. It'll be a nice, crisp, straight line, and you won't see any of those jaggies or artifacts that you would on a 720p. Now, the next thing to look at is your refresh rate on these displays. Now, refresh rate is not something I don't think I've ever actually seen that terminology used in the specifications, but what they normally just say is this is like a 60 hertz screen or a 120 hertz screen or a 240 hertz screen. Okay, that's all well and good. 60, 120, 240 hertz. What does that mean? Well, what that means is how many times per second that screen is capable of refreshing itself. And what I mean by refreshing it, going from absolute black to absolute white back to absolute black. So a 60 hertz screen will do that 60 hertz 60 times a second. 120, 120 times per second, and 240 hertz display likewise 240 times per second. Well, you might say, well, this is a no-brainer. More is better. The faster the better, right? Well, no, not really. And I'll explain why. Excuse me. Most pictures, movie pictures, that when they're out there filming them and they got their big cameras with the film and it's rolling through and they're actually recording it on film are only framed or only shot at 24 frames per second. Now you're displaying these at 60 times per second or 120 or 240 times per second. So what the displays need to do is they need to do what's called something called interpolation. Now what this means is it literally has to fill in the blanks between these frames because it's trying to display 60 or 120 frames when there's only 32. So what it does is it takes frame number 1 and say it's a picture of a speeding car. And it takes frame number 1 and it looks as to where that car is. And then it goes to frame number 2 and looks where it is in frame number 2. And what it does is it fills in the gaps and puts frames in between them. Now, what does this actually do? Well, in high-speed motion, if you're watching auto racing or a football game, sporting events are real good examples of where higher frame rates are better than lower frame rates. Watching it on a 60 hertz screen, a speeding car going by, you might see a little bit of blurring effect behind the car. On a 120 or 240 hertz display, you won't see that. It'll be a nice crisp image and it'll just go zooming right past you. So it does do a really good job at making high-speed motion much more crisper than a 60 hertz display. However, there are some downsides to interpolation. And one of them is an artifact that's known as the soap opera effect. Now, what this means is that if you're watching regular TV and you're just viewing a sitcom on TV or a game show or even a movie, what this soap opera effect does is it actually, because it's interpolating these frames, what it does is it makes it look almost too realistic. To the point where it doesn't look real anymore. It looks like it's made up. So a lot of people don't like this soap opera effect when they're watching TV. Some people do enjoy it. It is a matter of personal taste, but when you're looking at these displays in the showroom floor and you're trying to decide between this display and that display, you might want to look at your frame rates and look at the 60 hertz and then look at 120 hertz or look at even a 240 hertz display and see which one looks the best to you. There is no clear winner here. I can't say that a 60 hertz is better than 120 hertz or vice versa, but it's something to look at and something you should know about. Now the next thing is your aspect ratio, and This isn't something that you can really change on a high definition display, but what it basically is a ratio between the horizontal plane and the vertical plane of the display. Now, your old CRT units, those old big boxes that we used to watch all our content on, were at what's known as a 4:3 aspect ratio. And if you remember those displays, they were almost square. They were a little bit longer than they were high, but they still were almost square. Thus, the 4:3, 4 being the horizontal, 3 being the vertical. Now, all your high definition TVs are what's known as 16:9 aspect ratio. Thus, they're rectangular in shape, the 16 being your horizontal, the 9 being your vertical. What does this mean? Well, if you were when you were watching it on your old CRT, cathode ray tube is what that stands for. When you were watching it, a movie, say, on there, you may have noticed on some movies that you'd see this big black line on the top and a big black line on the bottom. That's known as letterbox format. And the reason for that is because that film was shot at a 16:9 aspect ratio. And in order to fit that whole picture on a display that is in 4:3, that is a physical 4:3 aspect ratio, what they have to do is they have to expand the screen size. They have to make it so that it looks like a 16:9 aspect ratio. Thus, they have to put those two black boxes, one at the top, one at the bottom. Otherwise, the left and right sides of that movie, that display, would be cut off and you wouldn't be able to see it. So that's where aspect ratio comes into play. Not really that important when purchasing, but it's something that you should know. Now, we're going to go from something that's at aspect ratio to something that's known as contrast ratio. Now, we're going from aspect ratio that not that important, to something that is very, very important. What is contrast ratio? Now, you're going to look at these little spec cards on the bottom of the TVs, and you're going to see contrast ratio, and it's going to have a number next to it that's shown in a ratio. You might see 100,000 to 1, 50,000 to 1. What does that mean? I have no idea what that means. Well, what that is it's how blacks the black are and how whites the whites are. And why is that so important? Well, on a screen that's got a really good contrast ratio, that has really good blacks, and by the way, the blacks are really more important than the whites, but something that has really black blacks, that picture is going to pop out at you. It's going to look much cleaner, it's going to look much more crisp, and it's going to draw you into the experience of watching that movie or TV show or whatever it is. If you look at a display that doesn't have such a great aspect ratio, and your blacks are kind of dark gray or medium gray, it's going to kind of wash out that screen, and it's not going to look that great. So you want to make sure that you're getting a set that has really, really black blacks. It's going to look much, much better to you in the end. You want to make sure of that, because you want that when you get it home and you look at it and you say, oh, it doesn't look as good as it did in the showroom floor. A lot of that might be because you've got something that doesn't have that really good contrast ratio, and your grays, your blacks are a little bit washed out, and it makes the entire picture less vibrant, and it doesn't jump out at you and draw you into the movie. Now, like I said, I'm not going to dig into the real deep down dark secrets into these technologies, because it's not something that anybody needs to know. I mean, the only ones who really need to know this are the manufacturers. But there is one area that I would like to address, and it's a misnomer out there, and a lot of this is caused by the actual manufacturers, and that is light emitting diodes. And you may see out there this new LED technology, these new LED TVs. Well, there's really no such thing as an LED display. They're all LCDs, or liquid crystal displays. But a liquid crystal display does not make its own light. It has to be artificially backlit. In the past, in the old technology, what they used to use is fluorescent bulbs. And these fluorescent bulbs would shine light through the liquid crystal display. Thus, you could see the picture. It would make the picture bright. Otherwise, you'd just have a dark screen. You'd still have all the motion, but it would be dark. You wouldn't be able to see it. This new technology, these light-emitting diodes, is what they're using now to backlit these screens, and they're much more efficient, and they do a much better job at actually lighting the screen, especially, and we'll mention this a little bit later, especially when it comes to contrast ratios. Now, plasmas, on the other hand, have these millions and millions of these little bubbles of phosphor in the display itself. And when these bubbles are exposed to an electrical charge, they produce energy. And it produces energy in the form of two types, the first one being heat and the second one being light. Now, even though that the majority of the energy being created, about 60%, is that of heat energy, the 40% of light energy that is also created is more than sufficient to light that screen and illuminate it so that you can sit and watch it and see the picture on the screen. Thus, plasma TVs are not artificially backlit. They produce their own light. And the brightness of these screens, the plasma displays, is just, they're regulated by reducing or increasing the electrical charge to each one of these little bubbles. And they'll get brighter or dimmer as depending on the electrical charge that's being implied upon it. Now we're going to get into the two different technologies, and we're going to go through different terminologies, and I'll give you an idea of which one at this point in time does a better job of with that basic specification. And the first one we're going to look at is brightness. Now, LCDs have always had the definite advantage when it comes to brightness. They're simply a brighter display because of the artificial backlighting. But one thing you have to remember when you're looking at these displays on the showroom floor, you're not viewing them in an optimal viewing environment, to say the least. And what they have to do to make these displays look good is they have to set them at the brightest possible setting that they can be set at. And this goes both for LCD and plasma. They go into the settings before they bring it out on the display floor, and they bump up the brightness to as bright as it could possibly go. And what this is known as is torch mode. Now, this is not optimal viewing. You do not want to watch one of these displays in torch mode. First of all, it's going to decrease the longevity and lifespan of the device. And secondly, it's just not going to look as good once you get it home. You got to remember, on the showroom floor, you got a lot of bright lights all around you, and you got a bunch of other displays. So they want to make these displays look as good as they possibly can. So they bump it up and put them into torch mode, and so that the screen really jumps out at you. The second thing I want to discuss is power consumption. If this is a concern of yours, then LCD still does a better job with electrical usage. It uses less than a plasma does. So if power consumption and your electric bill is a concern for you, LCD might be a better way to go. However, that being said, the new technologies in plasma have greatly reduced that gap, and they're pretty close to using the same kind of amounts of power to display. But LCDs still have an advantage over the plasmas. Contrast ratios, and like I said earlier, this is something that is very, very important. And if you really want your screen to look good, you want to make sure it's got good contrast ratio. Here, plasmas are the leader. They always have been. They just produce a deeper, blacker black than an LCD is capable of. If you go in, if you're a big sci-fi fan and you're watching Star Trek or Star Wars, where you got a bright planet pitted against a black space background, you're going to notice it looks a lot better on a plasma display than it will on an LCD, only because those blacks are blacker. Now, that being said, LCDs with the new LED backlighting have greatly narrowed that gap too. And in the higher end LCD displays, this gap is almost non-existent, and your contrast ratios are almost the same. But in the lower end displays, you definitely want to look at that display and make sure that your blacks are really black and not dark gray, because it will make a difference in your display in your viewing experience. And right now, plasmas still have the advantage when it comes to contrast ratio. Now, screen finish. This is a matter of personal preference. There's no winner, there's no loser. But plasmas have a glass screen, and they're highly reflective. So if you're going to be bringing your plasma home and putting it in your living room, and you don't have a lot of options for controlling the light in that room, and it's going to be always brightly lit, plasma might not look as good as an LCD, which has very little reflective surfaces. So, plus the fact plasmas aren't quite as bright as an LCD. So you might have a really tough time viewing a plasma in your living room if you have a lot of windows and it's shining bright light on the glass surface, as it's just going to reflect back at you, and you're not going to be able to see the underlying screen or the picture behind the glass. Screen burn-in. What is screen burn-in? Well, screen burn-in is something that plasmas have suffered from since day one, and to a certain extent they still do. LCDs, on the other hand, are not plagued with this. Now, what screen burn-in is if you have a static image on your display and you leave it on your display for a long period of time, that image could actually burn into the phosphors in the plasma display, and it'll show a permanent image. Well, it's not permanent. For the almost 90% of the time, it fades away with time, and you won't notice it anymore. But plasmas are definitely still subject to what's the screen burn-in effect. Now, what does that mean to you? Well, if you're just watching regular TV or a movie, then you don't have to worry about it. But if you're someone who, like, say, watches CNN and it's on for long periods of time, and you got that ticker tape on the bottom of the screen, well, even though the ticker tape might be moving, showing the different stock market prices and stuff like that, that black bar is not moving, and it's a static image. And over time, that could actually burn into a plasma display. Gamers also suffer from this. Now, even though a game, you might say, wow, that's moving all over the place, but your background might be static, and it might not be changing. It might just be the same. Only the figures in the game are moving. So if that static image is left on the screen for a long period of time, or a game is put on pause and you walk away from it and come back 3-4 hours later, that image may have burnt into your plasma display. So if you're a big gamer or you watch stuff that has a lot of static image on the screen, you might want to think twice before going to a plasma and choose LCD first. You a big sports fan? You like high action films, a lot of movement, a lot of motion? Well, then motion blur might be a problem on an LCD display. Plasmas do a much better job of crispening up that motion going across the screen and not seeing that little bit of blur behind a moving football or a racing Indy car going across the screen. On an LCD, you might see a little bit of blur behind that. Plasma does a much better job. Now, again, that being said, the newer technology, going to a 120 hertz display or 240 hertz display, will greatly decrease that motion blur that LCDs have been plagued with in the past. You're worried about how long the screen is going to last you? Well, in the past, LCDs definitely lasted longer than plasmas, but nowadays, with all the new technologies, there really is no clear winner, and it's an even race. And for the most part, you really don't have to worry about it, because most of these displays are rated for about 70,000 hours, which, if I did my math correctly, that's watching TV 24 hours a day for about 7 years. So the longevity, regardless of what technology you choose, whether it be LCD or plasma, as long as something mechanical or you have some kind of failure with the device, you should expect a long lifespan out of that display. Now, I'm sure you've heard of 3D. It's all the buzz out there right now, and there's 3D displays out there. But should you go to 3D? Do you even want 3D? Do you think it's a fad, or is it something that you're interested in? Me personally, I think 3D is a fad, and I think it's gimmicky, and you sit and watch a 3D movie, and you got things flying at you, making you duck out of the way. So most of the movies, this is what they're relying on in 3D. They want this effect. They want this gimmicky effect, and I don't know. It just doesn't appeal to me. But that being said, whether you want 3D or you don't want 3D, that being said, a lot of the 3D displays that are out there are your higher end devices and are much better displays than your just regular two-dimensional display. So that might be something to keep in mind when you're buying, even though you might not want to put on the pair of glasses and sit and watch a movie. Those devices, a lot of times displaying a 2D movie or TV show, look better than your lower end 2D only devices. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at it. Now, as I said before, when you go into the showroom, you have to keep in mind that these devices, a lot of times, these displays are all in torch mode. And they're being shown to you at the brightest setting that they can possibly be set at. So when you buy your big screen display and you bring it home and you take it out of the box and you set it up, you don't just want to plug it in and view it. What a lot of people don't understand or don't even know about is that these devices need to be calibrated. Uh, and there are people out there that professionally calibrate these high definition displays. Now, professional calibration isn't cheap, and it's going to run you anywhere from $200 to $500 depending on the display to have someone come in and adjust the hue and the tint and the color and the brightness and get it just right. Um, so that's an expensive, you know, it's a big expense when buying one of these things to have them professionally calibrated. Plus the fact it's time consuming. A professional calibrator is going to come in there and he's going to be there, or he or she is going to be there 3 hours calibrating that display. It's not something that is really quick. However, there are cheaper ways of doing this. And what you can do is if you have a DVD player, there are discs out there that you can buy that you put it into your DVD, and you'll get color patterns that'll pop up on the screen, and you can adjust your colors, and it'll do it for you, setting up the color and the hue and the tint and everything else on the display. The two that I recommend are the first one is called Digital Video Essentials, and it runs about $25, and you can get that at Amazon.com. Just do a search for Digital Video Essentials and you'll see it. The second one that I recommend is Avia 2. I think Avia is a little bit more, it's a little bit better than the Digital Video Essentials, but they both basically do the job. Avia 2 is a little bit more expensive, $50, and again, that can be found at Amazon. But the key factor here is you don't just want to take this display out and put it on your wall sectional and turn it on and view it. It's not going to be set up optimally. It's going to be in torch mode, and if for nothing else, to prolong the longevity of the device, because running it in torch mode is going to kill the display faster than if you have it set properly and it is not so bright. Now, another thing that people forget is sound. If you go back to the days when high definition TVs were non-existent, and we all watched our content on cathode ray tube TVs, I can remember a time watching it on TV, and you get an okay experience from watching this great movie on HBO that you saw in the theaters. That was so awesome in the theaters, but it was just okay on the TV. Likewise, watching that same movie on that same set top with a good surround sound system will draw you right into that movie, and it will make it look more like the view that you saw in the movie theater. It'll just feel like you're in the movie only because of the sound. Likewise, watching that same movie on a really good, high quality, high definition display using the dinky little speakers in the display itself is not going to draw you in, and it's not going to immerse you into the movie like it would if you had 5-to-1 surround sound system where you're hearing the sounds coming from all over the room. So you definitely want to look into getting yourself if you can afford it and if it's in the budget, getting yourself a home theater surround sound system. Now, there are good ones that are what's known as home theater in a box. They're not components. You just go in, you buy the box, you bring it home, and you set up your speakers and plug it all in. It comes with a receiver. You hook it to your TV, and you're all good to go. The ones that I recommend are ones, and I'm going to get into the actual models, but the manufacturers that I recommend are either Onkyo, Denon, or Pioneer. They all make really, really good high-end home theaters, some of which aren't that expensive, in the $500-600 range, and they do a very, very nice job of really making that picture jump out at you. In a lot of ways, sound is actually more important than the actual picture quality. Like I said, you can watch a movie on a so-so screen, but have really good sound, and it's going to draw you in. And conversely, if you're watching it on a really, really high quality screen with really bad sound, you're really not going to want to watch that movie. It's not going to be as immersive, and it's not going to be as good a quality um, from your perspective as it would with a really good sound system. Now, as with, like I said at the beginning, as with any of these technologies, there's legitimate arguments for both. Now, I have a general rule of thumb that I tell people when they're going out and they're looking at buying an LCD or a plasma, and they come to me and ask me, what should I get? What's better, LCD or plasma? Well, neither one is better than the other. It depends on what you're looking for. And what I basically tell people is if you're going to be coming home and you're going to be watching normal TV from your living room recliner or your sofa, and it's going to be in a brightly lit room where the curtains are going to be open, and you're going to have a lot of sunlight coming in, you just want to watch TV. Occasional movie, but you want to watch your sitcoms and your game shows and the news, then a liquid crystal display might be your better experience because, as I said, plasmas have a glass screen, and if it's in a brightly lit room, it's going to be very reflective, and coupled with the fact that plasmas aren't quite as bright as an LCD, it could make viewing in that bright room difficult on a plasma. That being said, if you're looking for the ultimate home theater experience, in other words, you're going to be putting yourself in a dark room and you want to take this 60-inch display and you're going to have your surround sound system on and you want to have the best experience you can possibly have watching Star Wars or Avatar or whatever you're into watching, then plasmas might be a better view. They simply do still have a better picture, in my opinion, than an LCD does. Their contrast ratios are still higher than LCDs, meaning, like I said, you get better blacks on a plasma. So, home theater experience, plasma. General viewing, watching an occasional movie here and there, LCD. When it all comes down to it and everything is said, it doesn't matter what I say. Go into these big box stores, look at the displays. The one that looks the best for you is the one that you need to get. I can't tell you which one's better. I'm not going to say Sony's better than Vizio or Vizio's not as good as Samsung. I'm not going to say anything like that. They're all good. They all have good displays. It's a matter of which one looks the best for you. And don't buy it based on specifications. Don't purchase it because the contrast ratio is higher on this set than it is on that one. But I kind of like the looks of this one better. Don't buy it because of that. Buy it because it looks the best to you. Well, that's about it for this week. So until next week, I hope you enjoyed the show. Next week, what we're going to be discussing is many of you may have gotten that new laptop that you wanted for Christmas along with that router. What we're going to do is discuss the actual setup of that router. Even though a lot of times you can take those routers right out of the box, plug them into your home network, and connect to them, there are certain things that you need to set on these devices to make sure that your privacy can't be compromised or settings can't be changed. So that's what we're going to discuss next week on My Elbow Earth. So until then, make sure you flip that geek switch and geek on. We'll see you next week. Good night.